we tackled aging America with the sugar daddy in the first segment. We did the womanizers. What happens when someone promises you the world? Is that actually binding? What about what we would like to call the accidental relationship? And that might be a little different than what you think it sounds like. So these might be two people who cohabitate, right? But nobody makes any promises. Right? So what happens in that scenario?
Well, so just to kind of walk us through this process, first we had two people that were kind of on an even playing field. They each knew what they were getting themselves into. That's the sugar daddy, the sugar baby.
Yep.
Then we had the womanizer, where there's some inequity there. You have someone making promises and someone else who believes them, but maybe there's no intent. They're false promises. Here we have two people that are kind of going about their lives and maybe make what's called an implied contract. But neither of them says, I promise you this. They really just don't have the conversation. So a lot of times they buy a home together and they each throw in the money they have, but they don't have a conversation about what happens when they break up. And let's face it, a lot of marriages end in divorce, and even more relationships don't end in marriage. So it's almost inevitable, and it's a conversation that people should have, but they don't. And then they break up, and one person wants their money back.
Is there and this is just flying up for me, so I apologize for throwing the track, but is there like a time requirement that kind of has to pre-necessitate this being an actual contract?
No, there's no time, but this is all fact-based.
Okay.
How long has this been going on? If I've been paying the bills consistently for the last 10 years and you haven't, what does that mean?
That's a good point. So let's say that there is a breadwinner. So let's say that, okay, so back to your point, let's say they own the house together, whatever, you can tell me however their, the vesting is, because that could obviously play a role in your answer. But let's say that let's say the monthly nut's $10,000, the breadwinner's putting in $7,500, maybe the home keeper or whatever is $2,500. So they're both contributing, but not equally. So what happens then?
Well, it's really up to the people. They're the ones that come to me with their crazy stories.
Okay.
I literally had a lawsuit that I defended. I represented the female who was the breadwinner in this situation, and she had a home, and her boyfriend, long-term on and off boyfriend, lived with her 6 months out of the year and would do stuff around the house. Part of his lawsuit was that he wanted repayment for the dog house he built. I mean, that was literally something he got an attorney and filed a complaint for.
Wow.
So, I mean, no one thinks about, when someone offers to do something in your garden, no one says, well, am I going to have to pay you eventually? I mean, no one has those moment-to-moment conversations. They just sort of assume you're doing it out of love, affection.
Right.
But then, the relationship ends and suddenly they're singing a different tune.
So, God, I'm almost kind of thinking out loud, I think a lot of this has to do with what's at stake, right? So it's if it's just a difference of, in my example, if it's a difference of $5,000 a month and, do the math, they were together for 5 years, whatever. That's probably not enough to go back and try to beat it out with lawyers and stuff about the inequity. It's probably more if there's real property involved or something, right?
In my cases, it's always real property involved. Yeah, both of us were putting our money together. And look, I've been on both sides of this type of case. Sometimes I believe that they did share their assets. They both had a joint bank account. They both put money in. They both spent it on the home, and maybe title was taken in one person's name alone. That
happens all the time for mortgage qualification purposes.
Right, credit purposes. Although you should correct that, either by quit claim or by contract. Yep. So, I mean, you should correct a title that does not accurately represent the intent of the parties.
Right.
But, sometimes they don't purchase the house, but they contribute. They contribute and they say, well, she promised me a portion of the house in exchange for my contributions, and suddenly they want a cut, and it's usually because the home's appreciated, right? And while they're living together, everything's great, right? But no one breaks up and says, it's okay, sweetheart, you keep that extra $30,000,
right? Yeah, gosh, it's interesting because you think about you said it the best, when you're in that position, I gotta believe that you're just seeing the whole thing through the lens of love.
Yes.
And so how do you even go back and twist your whole memory bank around oh, now I gotta monetize everything that I've done, right? And then the other person has to defend their super creepy.
It is creepy. I'm helping out a few people right now, and one of the partners, she did contribute more to the mortgage, and also paid the expenses at a time when the other partner didn't have the cash assets. And so now she wants all that money back. Well, the mortgage I get, but the expenses, I mean, don't you have to pay expenses anyway? Isn't that what you do if you are living with someone you care about? You just cover the expenses. And if not, then shouldn't you kick them out? Or, you know, if you had a roommate, you wouldn't just start covering for your roommate. You would say, hey, if you want to continue to live here, you need to pay equally. Otherwise, let's work something out.
Yeah, but that stuff happens all the time. I mean, you know this. There's a lot of people that are rescuers in the world.
Right. Right. And, you know, sometimes paying for other people and taking care of them makes people feel good.
Right.
So it's really unfair.
They find their sense of purpose in rescuing.
Right. So, you know, when someone offers, hey, let me cover that. I mean, should you be coming back to them and saying, well, do we have a contract that you're never going to come back to me for this money ever again?
See, and this is, I think, the biggest problem. And I'm going to call it a problem, not like a challenge and fluff it up. Like, this is a real issue because legal stuff seems to always happen in the rear view lens, right? So it's like, it's the same thing as like a prenup. Like, how unromantic is a prenup? You know, unless you're like, we were joking about Kanye and Kim, you know, earlier. Okay, well, they have estates. You know, they have gigantic wealth. Like, for the average person who maybe has a house before they met their spouse or something like that, and they're like, hey, let's prenup all this. It's like, ew. So you're not going to take care of me at all? Like, okay, that's kind of what we're doing here. We're taking care of each other. Like, so I'm on my own? Oh, that makes me feel super comfy about getting into this, right?
Right.
And, even more so when you're not even married.
Right.
Like, we're just boyfriend, girlfriend, maybe looking towards seeing if we like each other enough to marry each other. And then I'm like, hey, hi, I got this contract drawn up from my lawyer.
It's very unromantic. But it's also very sad at the end of the relationship when one party says, well, you owe me. And this happens all the time. Suddenly, people become legal experts, I guess. They go on the internet and say, well, you cheated on me and I contributed. I bought you dates.
There. That's the point taker. Isn't it probably mostly about who feels like they got wronged in the breakup? Right.
Yes.
Oh, you cheated on me? All right, well, I want my doghouse fee.
That's just true, and it's sad. But this happens all the time. And they're not always good cases. They're not always worth pursuing. In fact, you could argue morally, you know, are they ever worth pursuing? I think if you have contributed to jointly to an estate, to a property, to some enterprise, maybe to a business that you two built together, I believe that you deserve to share in that, and that's worth pursuing. The doghouse thing, by the way, I got that kicked out on the statute of limitations. I mean, you also can't go back 10 years and start asking for things.
Yeah, then you have to depreciate the doghouse.
Right. I mean,
What's today's value of the doghouse? Does the dog even like being in there?
Is the dog even alive? I don't know.
Exactly. So, okay, then what's the lesson? What's the takeaway? How do we get smarter from this?
I don't even know. You know, if you're buying a property, that's the place to start. If you own a home, you want to make sure that there's an agreement between anybody who's contributing money to that property. Or if you're purchasing it with someone, how are you taking title? Are you taking it in joint tenancy with the right of survivorship? Are you taking it in tenants in common where you each own 50-50? And if you're contributing differently, not 50-50, you can take title like that. Take it in 70-30.
And do a little bit more lifting on that, because I even know for myself sometimes I've been doing this for better half of 2 decades, and I even get kind of tripped up sometimes on what those little vesting things mean. So just give me a quick container around joint tenancy and tenants in common as it pertains to what we're talking about.
If you have a joint tenancy with the right of survivorship, then if something happens to you, the other person automatically gets it. No estate. It just goes from one to the other, and each person owns 100% of the property. If you have a
but while they're there, it's split up 50-50.
No, you each own 100% of the property. Period.
So if you're in joint tenancy, but there's 2 people on there, you're technically you own 100% of the property at the same time.
Correct. Right. You're a unit.
Got it.
Effectively. Versus tenants in common, I own 50%.
Or
you own
70-30, 60-40, whatever.
Right.
Right.
And when you're purchasing the home and you're looking at your finances, that should be a discussion, because the home is really going to be where the money is at the end of the relationship as the home appreciates, which
Right.
it usually does.
And there's like 3 or 4 other little ones in there that, by the way, if that's something that is pinging with you at all, even just in the in the vesting component, you might want to probably talk to somebody who can explain all that stuff and kind of parse it out for you. That might be a good opportunity to connect with T-Burd. That's Tara Burd. You can find her over at tbirdlawgroup.com, or you can call her the old-fashioned way. What's the digits?
858-215-BURD.